Great. Super. I can hear myself. Someone is unmuted. Welcome everyone to the first event of the our new discussion series by the AI Media and Democracy Lab. My name is Tomás Dodds. I'm going to be moderating this event. As you know, our first session will center around the impact of new digital technologies on journalistic roles and professional values. We have a great panel that I'm going to introduce in a second, but a little preamble. So this is an important conversation basically for two reasons. The first one is that there seems to be a gap on the literature between those who think that, or those who conclude that journalists around the world are adapting or appropriating these technologies successfully and making it match their journalistic values. And those perhaps more doomsayers who said that new digital technologies that are being introduced in the newsroom are causing high levels of distress among journalists. In any case, and the second reason why it's important to have this conversation is because we still have a lack of knowledge in many contexts around the world, and because these technologies are so fast changing, it's very important to see where we're going. So journalistic values are discursively created and constantly debated between editors and journalists in order to establish the boundaries of what it means to be a reporter today in contemporary newsrooms. But one of the questions that remains unanswered is what happens when platforms come into play. So if the boundaries of journalism are based on this negotiation between editors and journalists, how do you negotiate with Google's and Facebook algorithms? So the first question we're going to address today is what role are these platforms like Facebook and Google are playing in reshaping journalistic values and changing journalistic practices? And for that, we have a great panel for you today. First, let me introduce Pablo Boczkowski. He is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Latin Digital Media and faculty director of the Master of Science in Leadership for Creative Enterprises program, both at Northwestern. And then we also have Edson Tandoc, who is an associate professor at the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His research focuses on the sociology of message construction in the context of digital journalism. So I am make it easy for myself, and I'm gonna throw the first questions to you. I don't know if Pablo or Edson want to answer first. I'm going to point fingers otherwise.
Edson, do you want to go first?
Yeah, what was the question?
So the question we're going to start with is what role are these platforms playing, or platforms in general playing in reshaping journalistic values and changing journalistic practices?
I think definitely they're playing a big role, whether consciously or not. I think we've seen enough research to say that they are influencing or reshaping how journalists do their jobs. One of the research that I've been involved in looked at how journalists use social media in their work, and there's so many research on this, right? When focusing on specific role orientations, for example, in that paper that I co-authored with my PhD supervisor, Dr. Tim Voss, we were seeing that journalists were also talking about what we named as a marketing role, something that at the individual level of journalists, they were not expected to play before. When I was a journalist, I wrote my stories, submitted them by the deadline, most of the time after the deadline, and then and that's it. My day is done, right? But with social media, journalists are expected to tweet about their stories and also break the story first on social media, and then once the story is uploaded, and then they're also expected to promote it, right? Which is something that was not expected of journalists before. So I think that's one example of how the presence of these platforms has created a new type of responsibility, at least like a corporate responsibility that is expected of journalists now. And I think to some extent, audiences also expect the same thing from journalists now.
Thank you very much. Pablo?
Yes, thank you, Tomás. And first of all, thank you, Claes, Natalie, all the organizers for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's really a pleasure to be sharing the conversation with Edson, whose very, very prolific and important work has made important contributions already in how we think about journalism and democracy in general, in particular in relation to technology. So I want to start where Edson ended, which is with the audience. And I want to take slight issue at your formulation of the question. I think the values are negotiated not only between editors and journalists, but also with regards to the audience. And that is one of the main transformations. If I can preview a little bit, one of the arguments that Barbie Zelizer, Chris Anderson, and I make in our book, The Journalism Manifesto, that is coming out next month with Polity, what we say is that the audience in journalism, in the practice of journalism and also in journalism studies, or in how communication study has looked at the audience when it comes to news, if we take a 25 or 30-year arc, what we see is a big transformation whereby, even by the very early 90s, the audience was essentially unknown and taken for granted. Editors, as Robert Darnton wrote, reflecting on his work at the New York Times and the New York Star Ledger, journalists or reporters really wrote for one another. And they took pleasure in not knowing much about the audience and in assuming that the audience was going to be there, right? So digitization, what it has done, and platforms culminate this process. They don't start it, they culminated. It started really with the web, especially with the commercialization of the web, not the web as was imagined by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, but the web as was sort of as it evolved in the mid-90s with the first graphical user interface browser by Netscape and the commercialization of that. What it did for journalism is that the audience became known because every click is registered in the server, and that information for cultural transformations that are orthogonal to this became shared in newsrooms, whereby, the information that the marketing department always had about the audiences was not shared, but all of a sudden the information about metrics became shared. So the audience became known. And what knowing about the audience meant was that we could not really take it for granted anymore, because when the audience decided to spend time and pay attention to different information products, it really didn't go to the news. And that's why in America, for instance, 60+% of digital display advertising revenues goes to companies, right? They go to Alphabet and Facebook. Alphabet is the parent company of Google, the browser. So I think one of the transformations has to do with the unavoidable presence of the audience as interjecting in the relationships between reporters and editors when it comes to news values. And those values that seem to be somewhat sheltered from what the audience's practices day-to-day reveal to the newsrooms now cannot be really imagined without them. And we see that in transformations in editorial practices in mainstream publications like the New York Times, which is very different today from what the New York Times was like 25 years ago. It seemed like more like 25 centuries relative to what it is today in terms of tone, framing, subject matter, who gets bylines, etc. And also we see that in non-mainstream publications. So in that sense, the effects are, if you wish, indirect, but not less powerful for the practice of journalism and the role of the news media in democracy.
Something that Edson also mentioned was the increased level of expectation that this DataFi audience have on journalists now. So Edson, perhaps can we go a little more in depth into that? So as Pablo was saying, we have this ever-present, constant, and very on your face. I also saw it during my research, audience metrics. What kind of expectations do we have? Is it in the level of the content, for example, or the temporality of news production, when news should be published, what type of news, for example?
I think the first thing is in terms of speed. I think before, again, when I was working for a newspaper, we were competing with other newspapers. And so when you think of like, I mean, there is pressure for us to deliver scoops, right? But that means it's the following day. So we just need to make sure that the stories we put together today, that the competition is not going to get. But I think that one has changed because now we know what audiences are reading. If they cannot get it from one, and now they're also getting information even outside journalistic sources, right? If they see a video of fire going viral, right? They first see that outside journalistic sources, right? And so they expect to see that right away from traditional news sources. And if they don't get it from one news outlet, they can always go to the other. So I think there's more pressure in terms of speed, and before I would say that pressure to some extent was just in the minds of journalists. It's only us caring about our scoops. I mean, I was so obsessed with scooping the competition, but in the end, I realized the audience does not remember who got, who wrote the scoop of the day, right? But I think on online with news being digitized, and also with social media platforms, I think that pressure is has become more real for journalists because they can see what stories people are sharing, which links people are sharing online. So I think it's again like what Pablo said. Now we know we have some clarity in terms of what the audiences are doing, and that puts pressure. So I think audiences are first looking for speed, and if they can't get it from your outlet, they know they can get it from somewhere else.
Yeah, I did newsroom ethnography in a newspaper in Chile, and they have these two gigantic televisions hanging from the middle of the newsroom with all information provided by Charbit, and you can see how the news stories move up and down during the day. And it was, for some journalists, especially digital journalists, was like watching a racehorse, and they see how like they will make fun of you if your article didn't move up really fast. That is interesting. But you also have written about in one of your papers about how the web analytics is changing the process of gatekeeping, and it's a process that you call deselection. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So when I did my dissertation, I also tried to do observations at newsrooms in the US, and one thing that stood out to me was the process of selecting or deselecting stories that have been selected before. So meaning if it's time to update the homepage, and before the homepage was very important, and I think not so much anymore, but during the time when the homepage was very important, it was an important decision. It's an important decision to make which stories to replace, right? And most of the time when I was observing, the decision to replace is based on metrics. So if a story is underperforming, meaning it's on that spot, on that space, it's not doing as good as previous stories, then that's when editors would replace it with a new story, or a story that's buried in another a web page or another section, but is outperforming that section. So I thought that was interesting, making editorial decision, in this case, deselecting a story, almost purely based on metrics, basically what audiences are doing with that content. That's, I think, something that, at least before in the news, I mean, of course, deselection was not possible before in traditional media. So the ability to deselect a story of previously chosen is, I think, novel, and also the basis of those decisions being mostly based on metrics is, I think, also something quite important.
Super interesting. And now, Pablo, I want to throw the ball to you again, because you have written against technological determinism. And sometimes it seems that a bit of the literature we read about these technologies seems to indicate that because of the technology exists, then therefore journalists act. But these are editorial decisions. These are human decisions by the people who manage the newsrooms, who decide the level of importance that they give either to these platforms or to these metrics, right?
Yes. So let me continue building on what Edson said, and your observation about the Chilean newsroom, where you saw the heat maps, as they are called in the US, right, ever prevalent, and that we should not take that transformation for granted. That is a major cultural transformation in the history of newsroom dynamics, the major cultural transformation. There is no technological explanation for the reason for why that information is public. Let me share two anecdotes. The first one, when I was beginning, together with Eugenia Michelstein, to put together the findings for the NewsCap, I was at a meeting of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I was part of a group that tried to understand, the reception of science journalism and how to make the public more interested in scientific information. So I was asked to present findings from this study. And I showed, essentially the argument of the NewsCap, that there is a disconnect between the agenda as put forward by the media and what people click on. And then Corey Dean, who was a member of the group, Cornelia Dean, was the founding editor of Science Times. Probably the most influential in English-speaking language science journalism supplement in the world. And she said, she raised her hand and she said, when she was made editor of that section, the New York Times sent her to management boot camp. And she learned there, it's a weekend of management technique, that the marketing department had a lot of information about the audience, the readers, right? They crunched the numbers of circulation, but they also did recurrent surveys and focus groups interviews. So she was surprised to find out that her organization had that information. So she went on the next day that she went to the newsroom, she talked to her editor and said she wanted to have access to that information in order to better plan the Science Times. And she was told no, because you are not gonna cross the line between marketing and editorial, right? So only a few decades later, now we are obsessed, inside the newsrooms, journalists are obsessed with that information. So the information was already there and was technologically collected, right? The surveys, the focus groups, these are all social technologies in many ways. So there has been a cultural transformation inside news organizations, companies that are precursor for the processes of deselection that Edson talked about, that we really need to be mindful that they really go to the heart of major transformations in the culture of the profession and the culture of the organizations writ large, where professionals, news workers work. So it is these cultural transformations that are at stake here and that reveal a significant flux in the culture of the institution over time. This is not the institution, it's not the same institution in general, the institution that delivered the Pentagon Papers or Watergate in the US, right? So that's why it is important to be mindful of the affordances. It is important to be mindful of technological changes. But those are not the driving forces. The driving forces are largely cultural, and they have to do with cultures of information production and also cultures of information reception. And here, just one quick point, when we were asking Tomás about how the audience's expectations for datification, the audience by and large is not highly interested in journalism. And the audience by and large is not highly interested in the output of elite journalism. And how do we know this? So, and the work of Byron Reeves here is absolutely critical. Byron has been doing for now several years a wonderful project on what he calls screenomics. And in one of the earlier studies, he got permission to do recurrent screen captures of the windows on the browser, on the computer, actually not the browser, on the computer, of a number of undergraduate students at Stanford. And one of the first findings has to do with the average time that the screen lasts in the eyes of an undergraduate at Stanford. And the average time any screen lasts is 12 seconds. And that is on the computer. So on the phone, the hypothesis is between 5 and 7 seconds. And Byron is doing this now currently with mobile phones in different parts of the world. So you cannot really tell any story in 12 seconds, right? You can put a headline, a lead, and a picture. And that is what journalism is in the eyes of the audience. And we need to understand that the distribution in audience time is bimodal. It doesn't follow a normal distribution curve. There is 7 to 10% of the time that is spent on news. This is 7 or 10% of the population that spends a lot of time on the news, on the 90% or so of news time on websites, and the rest does not spend much time. In the US, the top 50 digital news sites have had a very stable number of the average duration of a session over the past several years, and that is 144 seconds. Notice the time that they spent on one story is the time that they spent on the entire session on the news site. The average subscriber to Netflix, when a new season of their favorite thriller is released, watches it in 4 days at an average of 150 minutes a day. When Casa de Papel, Money Heist in English, debuted the first part of season 5, right? And that was Friday, September the 3rd. I was on vacation with my daughter, and she and I finished the entire season in 2 days, even when we were on vacation. So we need to, in order to talk about the audience, we need to understand really where the audience is at. And the audience is willing to spend 150 minutes on a thriller a day, but only 144 seconds on average on the time spent on the site. And that means not reading a lot, basically looking through. And people in news organizations know this. They're very aware of this, and it's shaping how they operate.
Okay, I understand that, and I understand that perspective from the audience. But my question is then, what does it mean to be a journalist when you have to create news products that are basically either clickbait or that are made or supply for the algorithm or the formats that these platforms allowed? So my question is, are we seeing a mismatch right now between what journalists working in newsrooms think journalism should be and how it should be done, and what they actually get to do because either editorial decisions or because how these platforms operate? This is a question for both of you.
Yeah. That's a very difficult question. So let me process that first. And I think, I mean, going back with what Pablo shared, while he was sharing, I was also reflecting whether has it been this way even in the past, where when news was just newspapers, people were not spending the whole day reading a newspaper. The idea of the conventions associated with news writing has always been predicated on the fact that people are going to read this very quickly, right? The inverted pyramid style, for example, it's all so that people can read the first 3 paragraphs, which they do, and that they can understand it. So I'm thinking that maybe what we're seeing now is still a continuation of that. It's just that I guess there's more options now for audiences in terms of choosing where to spend their time. What the implication then on how we do journalism, I can see how, when BuzzFeed became extremely popular because of its charticle format, or listicle format, basically delivering news in bite-sized format, that did very well in terms of virality. It was also reaching a population that for that people thought are aversive, that are averse to news, right? I mean, young people are suddenly reading these listicles. But even for BuzzFeed during its heyday, long form stories were also doing quite well. Not all of them, but even for BuzzFeed, that at least in the beginning, didn't enjoy that. I would say a lot of I would say respect that we used to associate with traditional news platforms. They created good long form pieces that also surprised them because these did very well. I guess what I'm saying is, even with all the technology that we have now, we still cannot predict what story, what length, what format would do quite well. So even with the tools around us, I think there is still room for editorial guesswork. But how should journalists respond? I think we should, again, those are two things. I think two different things. One is how do we respond to the market, but at the same time, how do we fulfill our social responsibility? And definitely, while we can respond to the market by delivering bite-sized news, bite-sized news do not fulfill all of the responsibility that we have that they have as journalists, and as a former journalist. So yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yes, if I may build on that, I think even despite all the technological transformations and a considerable dystopic discourse surrounding them in the media and also among fellow academics, I think should some observation that most of the citizenry have a monitorial relationship with news about the polity, I think it still applies. And I do not think, therefore, that these new ways of consuming information, the decreased level of time spent on the news media, etc., necessarily negatively affect the role of the news in the democratic process. That is, most of the time, historically, people were not paying a lot of attention to news about the polity, which is why sports, for instance, was the #1 topic for a long time. And sports is the #1 topic of conversation among many people in their daily lives. And therefore, unsurprisingly, they read the news about that. So for a long time, it was like this. Now people have more opportunities, but we see that when there are national crises or issues of significant import to the population, like they used to before, they go and inform themselves. So the changes, so that's why I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's important to go back to the classics and retain the classics and challenge them when appropriate, but they have, I think, significant heuristic power in understanding how, the role of information in democracy. I would say, so the reality for most journalists in most newsrooms around the world is a reality of tremendous precarity in terms of their labor conditions. And in many parts of the world, in terms of the role of the state in protecting or not protecting them. And that not only applies to countries without democratic rule, they also apply to countries with democratic rule. Witness what's going on in Mexico and the reporters who report on the drug trade, etc. So while these issues of datification are important, I think it's important to put them in this context of the political economy of the profession, if you wish, and the precarity which they are. So most people producing the news will be on a freelance capacity at any given point in time, and they will have very little time to source and very little time and opportunity to go out. And it is therefore will be difficult for them to fulfill the idealized version that we have in our mind of the role of the journalist and so on and so forth. So it is important, even though the conversation is about technology, that we keep in mind both the economic and the political contexts of a world in which, unfortunately, there is a widening of income inequality and a worsening of the institutions of democracy in many parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that was where my question was pointing. So in the difficulties to fulfill the idealized work of a journalist. So this is, sorry, based on my research. So if you ask journalists what they think a journalist should do or how they should write, they will give you a list of, they should have context, it should have a diverse number of sources. But then, yeah, you can have political reasons or economic reasons that limit the fulfillment of the ideal. But in particular, I was wondering how these platforms are limiting for journalists in contemporary newsrooms, the fulfillment of the idealized version of the journalist, right? So yes, please.
No, please go on, but I would like to make a comment about the limiting part of it. Please go on.
Oh, that was basically it. So I'm for sure agree that there are material limitations to fulfill this idealized version of what a journalist should do, but then what role are these platforms playing also in aiding this limitation? And then I just finish.
So no, on the limiting, I think on certain instances they are being limiting, on other instances they are being very empowering. Because even in the so-called golden age of modern journalism, there were many groups that were not really represented and whose voices were not part of the news agenda. And when they were represented with framings going back to Bob Entman's and Lance Bennett's work, framings that were episodic and not systemic. So what we see around the world is that many times these marginalized communities have seized on the platforms to provide alternative vehicles for the construction of alternative narratives and the unearthing of facts that would not be the case anymore. Even in my home country of Argentina, there are two excellent news organizations that have a feminist take that push the feminist agenda that was largely silenced by the mainstream media, and that have had tremendous impact not only in the coverage of issues but in public policy. Argentina recently legalized the voluntary interruption of pregnancy. Argentina is a country with a strong Catholic tradition, but this is a matter of public health, and for forever women did not have the right to choose. And I'm not saying these news agencies are the only factor, but these news agencies were a channel in which alternative perspectives that were much needed in society and did not have a place even within the liberal media or the left-leaning media now had. And also these platforms were the avenue for the activists to organize themselves, right? As we saw in the US in 2020 with the killing of George Floyd, a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests were organized on platforms. So when we talk about, because it tends to be a very dystopic and negative view on the role of these technological systems in democracy, whereas I think it's much more mixed. And that negative view tends to be associated with a technologically deterministic discourse that turns subjects into historical objects, right? That they are passive recipients of the effects of the technology instead of being the active subjects that they are, right? And in that sense, that discourse disempowers, in a performative way, disempowers the citizenry rather than empowering them.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna say goodbye only to stop the recording. Please, no one leaves. So I want to thank Edson Tandoc and I want to thank Pablo Boczkowski for this talk. I'm gonna stop the recording, but I'm gonna then open the floor for to hear from the audience. I think there's a lot of activity I see in the chat. So give me 1 second.